We are live, indeed. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending our webinar today on how to improve your employer brand with more transparency, or maybe less transparency. We didn't say more transparency in the title, though. Maybe there's less transparency the way to go. So we're going to cover that today with Adam and Marcus. Let's start with a few rounds of introduction. To start with, I'm Virgil. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Figures that I created a bit more than like 3 years and a month ago now. Before that, I was like 11 years. I was an HR professional for 11 years, including, I think, a good chunk, like three years or so in the talent acquisition world, especially tech talent acquisition. And I created Figures to create the compensation management solution I would have loved to have back then when I was a HR person. And I've worked to the topic of today in very transparent context. I have a key personal belief around transparency that I might share more on later on. But before that, I'm going to start introducing our two guests that I have the pleasure of having on the webinar today. Let's start with Marcus. Marcus, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, salut and hello from Hamburg in Germany. Actually, I'm very happy to be part of this webinar. I was looking forward because I think this topic of transparency is always one that gets a little bit overseen in a way, it feels like. Maybe just a short introduction about me. I'm the founder of Human Employer Marketing. We are now 2.5 years old. We are basically consulting companies in every topic that occurs around employer branding, basically. We don't like the name employer branding. We rather call it employer identity. And yeah, I guess that transparency is a big part of it, basically. So I'll stop it here and then hand over to Adam.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Adam. I'm one of the two co-founders at a company called OpenOrg. If anyone follows me on LinkedIn, you'll know that I never shut up about transparency. So yeah, big topic for me. We're on a mission to rebuild trust by bringing more transparency to the world of work. Why are we doing that? I think lots of people probably can sense that anyway, but engagement rates are dropping, attrition's rising, employee trust is at an all-time low, and communication is a big part of that. That erodes trust and impacts company performance at the end of the day as well. So we've got a framework at OpenOrg and an accreditation that people leaders can follow to support them through cultural change. And we work closely with companies to take them through that. But we also run L&D programs for people and talent professionals who want to come together to learn more about open culture, accelerating change in their business, and connecting with other like-minded folks who want to believe in open as the new default.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Marcus. And in fact, to the point of OpenOrg, I think Figures, we were the first accredited OpenOrg organization, right?
You are officially one of the most transparent companies in the world and the very first to take the leap with OpenOrg. So yeah, forever a pioneer.
Very, very proud of this one. But before we talk about like broader, because OpenOrg is more than just pay transparency, and to Marcus' point, is more than just employer branding, or it's not even employer branding, but employer identity. One of the key reasons why transparency is becoming more and more of a hot topic, and not the only reason, right, has been the topic of pay transparency, and especially pay transparency laws, right? So I think it was interesting to start with a bit of context that pay transparency laws that we keep hearing about has been coming in. It's not a recent thing. Like some companies have experimented with, and some countries have experimented with pay transparency laws for a while now, starting, for example, Denmark a few years ago. But now it's been taking over the world by storm with pay transparency laws in the US. As of last year, there used to be 2 states. There's now 5 states, with 12 more states, I think, in discussion for implementing pay transparency laws with obligations such as disclosing your salary ranges on your job ad, which is the biggest thing, right? Everyone talks about. And then there's been the European Directive on Pay Transparency that are going to force every European country to implement laws within the next 3 years that will force them and will force employers to have more transparency when it comes to compensation, salary ranges on job ads, informing employees of their position in their salary ranges and their compensation compared to their peers, mandatory reporting on the gender pay gap. It will be forbidden as well to ask candidates about their current package, which is a big change in the world of compensation. Plenty of changes, right? But overall, there's more and more of a buzz, but some people are like, hey, it's a directive that will start being implemented within the next 3 years. Why should I care now, right? Why should I care now about pay transparency if it's only something that's going to happen 3 years from now? Well, I think, and maybe Marcus and Adam, you have an idea about that, because before it becomes a legal concern, before it becomes a compliance pressure, it's becoming more and more of a market norm to be more and more transparent. There's a huge need compared to that. Marcus, what do you think on that?
Naja, I think it's better actually to get ready for this topic right now rather than if you're legally obliged to do so, basically. So, and I mean, you do not just turn the switch and suddenly everything is transparent, especially salaries are transparent. So it rather takes some time to open up. I mean, I went through this process. Maybe I can tell a little bit about this later on, but yeah, better get ready now than rather waiting for 3 years and then everybody gets hectic and has to start implementing this, basically.
Adam, before I get back to Marcus' own experience with pay transparency, what's your opinion on the?
You act now, you've got a competitive advantage versus everyone else. If you wait until it's legally enforced, people aren't silly. They can see that this company is doing it because they have to. They're being forced to, not because they want to. And the companies that do this now, Figures, other open orgs, other companies who aren't open orgs yet, but will be one day, they have a competitive advantage, and that feeds into employer brand for sure. So that's certainly reason number one. Reason number two is this is a lot deeper and more complex than you probably realize at first. It's not just about chucking some salary bands on an advert. Might be for smaller companies, but you very quickly realize that there's some intrinsically linked things to pay. You have levels and bands in place. Suddenly people need to see career development frameworks. You've got to get them in place. Then you've got those in place. People expect to understand how they can progress through those frameworks, and they want performance calibration frameworks. So there's a lot that feeds off pay. And if you don't start looking at that now, it's going to take you a lot longer than you realize to get it all in place internally before you can externalize it as well.
And so we're going to get, before we get to Marcus' own experience with pay transparency, a bit of housekeeping I didn't go through. You can ask your questions in the chat. We'll take questions as we go, if some are relevant to the topic we're addressing at the moment, or there's a Q&A session at the end. So, but in any case, if you have any question, please send them through the chat. Marcus, so maybe you have your own personal experience when it comes to pay transparency. Can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Maybe first about the circumstances. So I used to work for Xing. I don't know if you guys know it, which is kind of the German kind of LinkedIn, let's put it like this. So it's a professional social network, and I used to work there for 8 years. So that means there was a time without transparency, and then there was a time with transparency, because I think like part-time or half-time I went through, they introduced this topic actually, and it was pretty interesting to see the process. So maybe to give some background on this as well, we talk about 1,500 employees across I think it used to be 5 European countries in that time. And I remember back then just being an employee and not a founder as I am today. It's kind of everybody was sitting there and waiting. Okay, today is the, let's say, 15th of April. Today we will get the full transparency on everything. And then I think what was like one of the learnings there is actually cool. I can see how much Peter is earning, and I can see how much Tina is earning, and so on. No, this is complete bullshit. So they also used salary bands, basically, which are just indicators which show, like, let's say, all the marketing employees in our company have the following distribution of their salary, basically. What was interesting, you could, of course, identify certain colleagues by comparing, like, okay, who's the senior vice president marketing or whatsoever. But overall, I have to say it was quite an interesting process to see this getting involved. And I think what companies have to keep in mind is that you don't only make something transparent, basically, but there will be a reaction to that. I mean, I'm sure, Virgil, you know much better than I do what this means to companies. But what happened then is, like, everybody was comparing, each other. And then, of course, the discussion started latest in the annual reviews on how much money everybody is making. the cool thing is what they did back then is that they really tried hard to make it as fair as possible for everyone, and also enable the leaders in the company to kind of have a proper argumentation about who is where. I mean, of course, without giving any names, but it made things much more comparable. And yeah, I think it was a tough job for the management, but after all, everybody was pretty satisfied about the process. And I guess then in the long run, it also made things much easier for winning new talents for the company to be really transparent about, hey, this is your range, this is your experience, and based on these two factors, I'm sure there are much more factors, we're going to put you into this salary level, for instance. And so I would say, in a short summary, first, it was a bit painful, especially for the management, but after everything was introduced and all the questions were answered, it made it much fairer for everyone involved.
It's very interesting, Marcus, and very interesting seeing a company doing it that early and at scale as well, because I was mentioning I've been part of my last two companies, including Figures, I've been fully transparent on salaries, so individual salaries too, right? I'd like to think there's like 4 levels of transparency. One is more like transparent on your policy. 2 is more transparent on your processes, which is how do you determine someone's hiring package? How do you do compensation reviews? The third one is on like bands, the one that you kind of described. First one is ultimate transparency on salaries, where you know what everyone earns. And I've done that. We've decided to do that at Figures. I've done that in my previous company. I think it was amazing in terms of trust it generated, but I wouldn't say it's something for every company, right? But it's cool. One of the key things we keep hearing is, okay, it works when you're 40, 60, 70, like where my 2 previous companies, including Figures, but not at that scale. But it's interesting to see a company like Zing being that innovative and making it work at that scale. What's your feedback on that? Yeah, go, Marcus.
Do you do it? Sorry, Vijay, that's a question because I find it really interesting. Like, would you rather go for the option to work with salary bands and give indicators, or would you really open up and say, Virgil owns this and Peter earns this and whatsoever?
So I think we have in our DNA a very hyper-transparent culture, so it made sense to go with transparency on individual salaries. But I wouldn't say it's for every company. And this is a good point because I think every company identity is different, culture is different, and for us, it felt normal, like going to the extent of individual transparency. However, I don't think it's applicable for every company out there. I don't think it should be done for every company. However, I deeply think that any company, and I've been thinking that for years, should trend towards full transparency on salary bands and salary ranges, right? Not individual transparency, because I know some companies, some people are not at ease giving away their salary as well. But on salary bands and salary structure, I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's the fair thing to do as well. And I think every company should trend towards that. And in any way, legislation trends toward transparency on salary ranges. So it's a good thing to have that in mind.
Yeah, I agree. I think the company size thing's a massive myth. Like, it's some of the larger companies, huge corporates, particularly in the UK, are the most transparent when it comes to pay. Public sector companies, they've got very, very rigid, strict bands and pay scales and grading systems that everyone knows typically what other people are on above them from a banding perspective. And if there's one thing that large corporates do well, it tends to be more transparency around pay and what other people are on. Forget the rest of the stuff that they get wrong around culture and communication, etc. For now, we'll come back to that later. But I think that it's rubbish, basically. There's nothing to do with company size. It's an excuse. And yeah, just to chip in my view as well, I agree with Virgil. I think the issue around the word transparency is people freak out a little bit when they hear that word, and they automatically, their mind goes to individual salaries. They think, I'm going to have to start sharing salaries with individuals, bonuses, all sorts. There's going to be fires everywhere. Transparent doesn't necessarily mean radical, and you've got to separate those two words and throw radical in the bin, and focus more on actually why we're doing this. What's the purpose? And when you think about that, the bands, they're enough. That's all you need. People don't care typically about what other people are on, and particularly if you are doing it right and being fair, people won't care about what other people are on. So it's just getting to that stage where you can show people that absolutely, we pay fairly. We can show the workings out behind it, the data behind it, what that drives our decision, the tools we use, aka figures, and we trust in what we're doing. And people will in turn trust that and not look to their peers and want to know what they're all on.
But then the key question is, okay, so we're going to have to be more and more transparent, right? What we're saying by law is going to be, so I have to wait for the laws to come out before starting my own journey towards pay transparency. Is that the right way to go for a company? I wait till the law come out. Transparency is something for tomorrow. Why should I care about today? Marcus, why should I care about transparency overall or pay transparency before the laws actually come in and become a factor?
Yeah, as mentioned, I think it's really about getting ready for the future or what's coming up. And I mean, jumping back to this process that I experienced myself as an employee, I think this initial project, to bring a transparency into like only the salary bands took at least 6 to 9 months. So I think it also needs kind of a long ramp up time to get ready and answer every question, also, or especially on the legal side as well. And but on the other hand, I think it's a really, really good sign towards your employees that it's not just who has the the most of the friends in the company or is the most popular one gets the highest salaries, which is completely bullshit. But it's also about comparability in a way. I see there's a question actually, which I might fit in at this point. Do you worry that companies might become performative with transparency, especially when it is enforced? Yeah, exactly. Here we go. I'm a little worried that it could end looking like greenwashing.
Thoughts on this one? I have one, but do you have one, Adam? Marcus, you want to jump on this one beforehand?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in for sure. There's a few companies out there people might point out as maybe using transparency as a bit of a PR exercise, and they're easy to spot because they're names that tend to come up a lot. But generally speaking, our advice, if we're speaking to companies, is find your own level of transparency that contextually works for your business, and it doesn't have to be telling the world that you're radically transparent and too out there. Actually, some of the best, most transparent companies deal very well with internal transparency and don't have to shout about it to the world. There's one of my all-time favorite companies. It's a company called PostHog. They're a very small company, but they've got the most incredible public handbook. However, you will never hear them shout and scream about the fact that they're transparent. They share their public roadmap with the world, their competitors. Everyone can see inside their business. They do that because they trust and believe in that that's the right way that they're going to succeed and win as a team. And they've got very clear reasons for that, but you'll never hear them talk about that online. And finding your way of doing it is the most important thing. If your company or your CEO or your founder wants to be transparent for the sake of it, for performative reasons, that's, I guess, their prerogative. You can use that to your benefit, but that is the danger that we fall into with the world of employer brand. You start presenting a shiny artificial version of yourself that's not actually true, and that's what we're trying to tackle in our own way. So we're trying to encourage companies to not go over the top, not feel like they have to be radical, but find what works for you, make sure it's got meaning and reason, and make sure you're sharing things for not for the sake of it, but for proper reasons within your business.
Yeah, plus I also don't see the risk on that it might look like greenwashing or something like that, because if companies decide to be transparent on their salaries, then basically it also makes them accountable. And then they also need to be able to answer questions when it comes to, what are certain reasons or what are certain, waypoints basically to decide on how much the respective salary is supposed to be. So I think it rather increases transparency internally, but also you are much more to the point when it comes to, for instance, job interviews, when people ask, all right, so what is my salary going to look like? I also remember that since a few years now, also in Austria, it's mandatory to put the salaries in the job ads and stuff like that. And I really, really like this transparency, basically.
Well, I agree with you. I think it can be, at worst, it's a win-win in the sense that, unlike some greenwashing initiatives, like some airplane company or other being like, we've planted 100 trees per year, so we're good, like carbon-wise. It's really tough to be like transparent on compensation without being accountable internally, because as soon as you put that job ad there, there's consequences, right? Some of the, and maybe we can post the example in the comments, right? One of the famous cases for pay transparency is the US. was a woman discovering, like live tweeting her journey. She discovered that there was a job posting on her own role whose salary range was like 20K above what she was making, right? And I think that initial tweet got like 250K likes. And then she live tweeted through, I'm going to apply to my own role externally, citing that I'm excited by the prospect of his salary, and it blew up completely, right? So if the company was like, okay, we're just going to comply, we're going to make it nice and easy, it blew up completely in their face. So I think that won't happen. In a way, I'd like to compare it with, donation to charities and stuff like that. Are some people donating because it makes them feel good, or it makes their image look better and so on? Maybe at some point that money still goes to some association and some charities. So you are accountable once you're giving the money, you are accountable when you're being more transparent. And we've proven that the more transparent you are, the more fair you are. And I didn't say that at the beginning of the webinar, but we have to understand that the context of those pay transparency laws in Europe, at the very least, they originate from the working group at the European Parliament working on fixing the gender equality. So the purpose of pay transparency is not pay transparency for the sake of transparency. It's transparency for improve gender equality and equality, in fact, overall. So I think it's more of a win-win thing than a risk that is going to be reused by companies. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, there's something that we also, sorry, and just one comment on this, like, because I think companies need to adjust to the current or the nowadays information structure. What I want to say with that, everything is kind of transparent thanks to social media, for instance. And I mean, we have Glassdoor, we have Kununu, we have all these employer review platforms and so on. And even the job boards are starting now to crunch numbers basically and want to find out what are the salary ranges basically. So it will come to it will be public anyway at one point. So rather go into the driver's seat basically and decide on what will be transparent about the salary of your company.
But I think that's an important point by Marcus, right? So we are getting to the conclusion that pay transparency is inevitable. It takes time to adjust. And Marcus, you mentioned 6 to 9 months. I think it's going to be worse for some companies that, beside fixing and communicating on salary ranges, have to fix up their internal inequity and inequality on pay, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the point we're getting to is it's not going to stop at pay transparency, is it, Adam? Is that going to stop on pay transparency and the push for transparency?
No, I mean, pay is obviously a huge driver, particularly when you're looking at like external employer brand and job applicants. But it's easy to forget that when you talk about employer brand, there's an internal employer brand as well. It's not just about how applicants see you; it's about how your employees see you as well. And once you're in a business, pay is important, of course, but there's a whole host of other things that become important to employees. Understanding how decisions are made, and basic communication, understanding things like career progression and performance reviews. Some of the things we touched on earlier that are linked to pay still. There's this whole web of areas within your business where you can show transparency, and there's genuine reasons for why you would and benefits for each of those. We've got a framework that covers about 35 different possible areas, and pay is one of those. So when you talk about things like culture and diversity and flexibility and things like that, there's so many areas that you can focus on. You're not having to necessarily look at trying to make radical changes in any of these things, but making 1% changes, tiny little tweaks in terms of how you communicate, commit to change, to doing things a little bit better, a bit more open, can really drastically improve that employee experience. There's two halves. There's the candidate experience and the employee, but the best companies will get those both aligned. So they're completely mirrored. And that intersection of going from being an applicant to an employee, there's no surprises on day one. What you see is what you get. And that's exactly what we're doing.
Virgil, I have a question to you, because, I assume that most of the companies do not have like fair or equal salary bands. Let's put it like this. Some people are in the company for a longer time, some are for a shorter time, some come from a job where they maybe had a really, really bad salary and they're happy about getting 5K more whatsoever. What's your recommendation on implementing salary transparency into a company? Because would you first go and see that this equality gets there and things are more fair, or would you rather implement salary transparency and then afterwards fix it? Because this could also create kind of a turmoil within the company, or?
No, it's for sure the former, right? I think the work towards pay transparency doesn't start with transparency. It starts with strengthening your compensation policies and practices, auditing your internal equity, improving and auditing your processes as well, because improving your internal equity is fine, but if you have processes that keeps adding up to that inequality, like hiring people at a much higher package than anyone you have internally all the time, poorly discretionary based compensation review is going to create more inequality. But once you've done all that, then you can start thinking about how to communicate. And I like the narrative around compensation, because 99% of companies don't communicate about compensation. It's a black box. That's going to change, and most companies are going to need to take action and control the narrative around compensation. But once again, we're thinking it's like beside compensation, it's more than just compensation, and transparency impacts more than just pay. And what do you think about that topic of like employer branding, and in fact the impact of transparency on employer branding, Marcus?
I mean, I think this is key, basically. I mean, what are we talking about when we speak about employer branding? We talk about the positioning of a company internally, but also externally, as in the best case, an authentic and interesting, attractive employer, basically. And I think this pretty much starts with the very first touch point that people have with a potential new employer, basically. What I want to say is, like, you know, if I like go online and try to derive all the information that I find about a certain employer where I can imagine to work for, and of course this whole picture should kind of have a red thread in it, and it all makes sense. But when then I see, for instance, on Glassdoor that there's super unequal payment of salaries, basically, then it's not a fair thing. And if they are maybe positioning themselves like, oh, we are so transparent, we are completely democratic here in our company, then this is like kind of a break somehow, which companies should clearly avoid, I think.
And so, okay, employer branding as a process of like improving the information you share proactively with candidates on your career page and so on, like being as transparent as possible. What do you do? What could company do when we start thinking of the candidate process, like the candidate interview as part of the interview process? How can company be more transparent there? Adam, any suggestion, actionable tips you've seen from some companies there?
Heaps, yeah. And there's a link that's been shared as well, which is something we threw out there recently, which was like an open hiring playbook. So best case scenario, companies have got their internal processes, policies, everything in their employee handbook mirrored externally for the world. That's where we would love to get to. If you're not quite ready to share your policies, etc., with the world, you could create an open hiring playbook, which is basically everything that a candidate or an applicant could possibly need to know about your culture, your hiring, your the general sort of company information, when and where you work, key information about what life is going to be like in this business. I think that the problem that most people fall into, and I blame the employer, a lot of employer branding agencies for this, generally speaking, is you see these shiny career sites and people sort of are quick to say, hey, we're transparent. And that's maybe where the greenwashing stuff comes in a little bit. It's like, let's jump on that word, let's weaponize it and say, hey, we're transparent. You dig deeper, actually, there's nothing to read on that website. There's no information that I can gain. There's nothing in the interview. Take a bit of an approach of like show, don't tell. Like show people you've got a playbook, fill it up with information, let people go and dig through your business and understand how it works. There's no excuses not to share any of this information with people, in my view. So
no excuse. Let me jump on that, Adam and Marcus. No excuse really, or is there some potential negative aspects of transparency or like bad experiences you've seen companies go through when they're like, okay, there's no excuse, I'll start being more transparent, that maybe regretted it, or were transparent? Do you have any example?
There's two that I would lean on, but they're avoidable. One is weaponizing that word transparency and also not defining it. You ask 100 people on the street what transparency means to them, you'll get very, very different answers. So again, a company saying on their website, we're transparent, 100 different applicants will take that to mean different things. And a bunch of them might arrive in the business thinking, oh, these guys are transparent. That means they're going to share their funding and their finances and their burn rate with me. They might not be intending to do that at all. So define transparency, and that avoids it being weaponized. If you can give it some guardrails there and show employees and future employees what transparency means here. It gives people very, very clear expectations as to what to expect. But transparency can be weaponized if you don't take ownership of defining what it means within your business. I've seen a lot of companies that we speak to who have gone and made transparency one of their values, but they've not really done anything around that. And suddenly employees are saying, oh, why aren't you sharing this with us or that with us? And it causes them problems, but it's avoidable if you define what it means. And just quickly, the second problem that I would see and have seen, again, intrinsically linked to pay, is rushing this, which is why you should start now, because companies are very quick to say, hey, let's go chuck some salary bands on our adverts because we know what we are going to be paying. Suddenly your current employees see it and are in shock, like your example you used about the lady on Twitter. But then you realize, okay, we need to answer questions around career development and performance, and managers are getting bombarded with questions and they're not ready for these conversations. So rushing it is an example of where if you try and become too transparent too quickly, you will struggle and you will run into problems. So you need to take baby steps here and see it as a journey.
Yeah, I would underline what Adam said, because I think it's actually about the definition of transparency as well. I mean, if you stand there and say we are a fully transparent company, that would mean that every employee would have the right to get into every little secret that's out there, and maybe even things that should not be communicated because of the capital markets, for instance, And I mean, when you think about it, it's also, I mean, when we talk about employment, we talk about a relationship. And I mean, if all of us think back to maybe our partner at home, and if there's like, you have this slight feeling of, there's like maybe a lack of transparency, or maybe I don't get the full picture here, what happens? It directly creates a negative feeling somehow. And I think once this negative feeling comes up, it's pretty hard to fix this as well. So yeah, for sure, if transparency done wrong can completely destroy also the trust base. And I think this is pretty hard to fix.
And I was about to ask you what best example of transparency you've seen from companies, like some example of what you've seen in some of your client companies, other companies you admire. I'm going to share an example of extreme transparency with you, one that ties to what you are saying, Adam, about making sure that from the moment where you're a candidate to the moment where you're an employee, you don't feel like you have a different experience. What you saw as a candidate reflects true as an employee, right? One example I have around that is my previous company. And what they were doing is that at the end of your hiring process, you could spend 2 days within the company and literally embedded within the company. And not 2 days to work, not some of the things Revolut were caught to do, like on their hiring processes for like SDR or salespeople. Whoever brings the most friends on Revolut is going to get the job, not stuff like that, but actually just getting into the company, talking to people, seeing how meetings are run, being in the office and so on. So actually my previous job, before taking the VP of people role there, I spent 2 days just talking with people. And I know it took 2 days, so it's 2 days of leave I took from my previous company. So it was a commitment in time, a commitment I was willing to make because I think it's important to choose the right place and the right environment. But whenever people ask me 1 month after starting the company, what surprised you? Are you disappointed, surprised, shocked? For the first time in my life, I was like, there's absolutely zero surprise about my role, the people, the working environment, the culture, because I got to spend it 2 days with them before I joined. Do you have any other example, maybe less extreme, of transparency as part of employer brand and candidate experience? Adam?
Yeah, there's a company called cal.com who they don't, like you say, don't go that full on, but there's a few companies that do this, but like paid work trials almost as part of the interview process. So they have like a bounty wall, I think they call it, and they will actually get people to work on live projects that are being worked on in the business now, for example. They'll pay candidates for it, so you're not doing free work, but it gets you intrinsically closer to the team, the business, what we're working on, how we're doing it. Really, really cool. And it's not going to work for everyone, and it doesn't need to be done, but it's an example of what you can do to try and bring people into that business as much as possible without the traditional interview process, which has its flaws. So that's one that jumps to mind for sure, which is similar to what you mentioned.
Marcus, any example you have in mind of like great transparency?
It's not really an example, but I mean there is this term that brings how to say, sweat and fear to some of the recruiters, which is actually the realistic job preview. And I think this is something that can be hard for certain companies. I mean, you know, we have a hardcore lack of skilled workers. This is nothing new, actually. And I think there's a lot of companies that are happy nowadays to have talents or like candidates in the interviews. And then what I always say is like, you should really avoid to tell people like stuff that's not really right there. And I mean, when it comes to transparency, and when we talk about realistic job previews, then of course you cannot only talk about the good things, you also have to talk about the things that are maybe not that good and where the company has to get better in. So, I mean, what this realistic job preview is about, it is about basically transparency, and it's about to, you know, provide a way richer description of the job, such as, you know, how is our work environment? What are the duties like? What are the expectations that you can have once you start there and stuff? And I think in order to be that transparent, you also need to be sure what this job, what the respective job is basically about. Because if this is not happening, what will be the consequence out of this? People might start working for you, but then they find out everything that I was told in the interviews not really as they told me, and then people are going to quit. And then it's like a lose somehow. The talent is kind of annoyed for starting and now started the whole process over again. The recruiter gets blamed by the respective areas that wanted to hire this person. And then, yeah, I don't know. That's why I think, especially in this recruitment part, in the recruitment scenario, basically, it's really, really important to put everything on the table and not hide anything as well.
And I think, before getting back to Adam on this one, a point that's often lost in transparency, and I think is often considered by some business leaders as like, oh, why are you talking to me about transparency? Like those vague, non-business related topics that has no impact on the business, just like potentially sometimes HR being HR, wanting to be transparent, like it's a naive thing to think and so on. But one of the last point you mentioned is very important, is like bringing in someone who doesn't have the full knowledge on what they're going to be living through as part of their job, having that person. So you take 6 months to find someone, they take 2 months to come, they come 2 months in, they resign. The cost of such a resignation
exactly
is so crazy high that just from a pure business perspective, you have incentives to ensure that the person know what they're signing up for, right? So just improving, ensuring there's no voluntary regretted attrition and all the associated costs is a business case for more transparency. Adam, what were you about to say?
Yeah, I think for me, everyone will differ on this point of view, but I firmly believe that cultural alignment is the most important thing to get right. Even though it might not be the immediate thing that applicants look for, there's no point in taking a job where you're well paid or get loads of flexibility if you're going to leave after a couple of months because that cultural alignment isn't there. And if you don't get that right, if you don't get an upfront, honest understanding of what that looks like, it all falls apart, which is why we focus on much broader areas as well as pay. But I agree with Marcus's point. There's a company called Plane.com that jumped to mind. And if you haven't checked out their job ads, go have a look. They have very clear sections on like why you shouldn't apply to this job, which I know might sound a bit crazy to some recruiters out there, but there's recruiters and TA teams who are buckling under pressure at the moment from applications. And the world of employer brand is always trying to focus too heavily on filling top of funnel, seeing it like casting a big fishing net and capturing as many people as you can. Try telling people why they shouldn't apply. Be honest about the realities of the job, the trade-offs that are involved. It might be that you're, having to actually work very long hours, but you're getting to work with some of the greatest minds and build the best technology in the world, for example. So being very realistic will help put people off. And there's a company that we worked with a month or so ago in one of our cohorts. They got 5,500, I think, applications to one job ad, one hire. So over 5,000 people who got rejected. And there's a candidate experience thing there that let's not go in too deeply into that, but how you deal with them is really, really important to your employer brand as well. So you can reduce that massively, and people are okay not having to apply to a job. They understand that they can make informed decisions as long as they're given the information, but companies don't give them the information.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to translate a German saying. I don't know if it makes sense, but it says on every for every pot there is a lid that fits. I don't know if there's anything like that in English, but I hope you know what I mean. And I think this is a really important point here as well. I always underline that people think employer branding is the new recruiting super weapon, basically, but it isn't, because it is also a perfect filter for those that you do not want to have. It's not exactly about salary transparency here, but a while ago I heard about a consultancy firm from southern Germany, close to Munich, and they clearly said, if you want to have 9 to 5, if you want to have a proper work-life balance, if you want to have a really comfortable and cheesy work environment, then please do not apply for our company. And I find this super, super honest and open. And this also saves a lot of work. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys how annoying it can be that your recruiting pipeline is full with candidates where you already know beforehand, no, they're not suitable, maybe from a cultural point of view, from a salary point of view, from a task point of view, and so on. So this is a perfect way also to filter out people. And honestly, I mean, all of us had the situation where we think, wow, he or she is so good, we need him or her, but we cannot pay his or her salary. Yeah, then don't hire him, then don't try to get yourself into into trouble. Then just, it's also kind of a self-protection, I think, for hiring companies.
And so first of all, I'm gonna say, if you have, once again, folks, any questions, throw it in the chat. We're gonna take some of the last questions now. So please throw them in the chat. But getting back to your last points, both of you, in fact, the importance of being upfront enables you to have less false positives throughout the hiring process, less people who you're gonna talk to at like potentially just screening time. That might be, you might have lost 30 minutes, or worse, they get through the process, you realize at the end of the hiring process they're not a great fit for some elements you could have known beforehand by being more transparent, or worse, you hired them and you discover 2 months in that's the case. And I'll use one example of this that's interesting with the current conversation at the moment. Like, I met once again on Friday morning a CEO of a company, US company, who are very upfront about like no remote in our company. Like, we want the office first culture and so on, so we can tolerate a few remote days here and there if really necessary, but if not, everyone in the office. And you know what, that's very controversial, especially in Europe, I say to say that. But what she told me is like she's drowning in applicants of being tired of being into dead hybrid or remote first offices with no one there. And I think she went against the grain very early to say a year and a half ago, say, we're not going to be remote. If you look for remote or flexible culture, that's not the place to be. Once again, don't apply here. And I think it was perceived as controversial in the era of like flexibility first and so on, but they are drowning in candidates who love that they're very upfront about this cultural element. We have a question on the Guillaume, saying the bad buzz of FRTech ecosystem. Yep, I see who you talk about. Because so bad buzz from a company that did indeed say you shouldn't apply to this role if this and this, so some anti-criteria, right? But indeed they use them with some potentially illegal, potentially some illegal ones, right? We can't say much more about. I think we can say much more. It was like a very mobile banking company, and they said if you don't have one of our accounts, you shouldn't apply. And this is like discriminatory to prevent people from applying. They don't have the account and so on. So I think yes, it caused a bad buzz, but I think it would have caused. It's not the principle of having anti-criteria that caused a bad buzz. The way they went about it in using stuff that
the focus should be on like culture and how we do our best work together, not like whether you've got an account. So yeah, obviously it's still okay to do that, put those things on ads, but don't make the focus on whether you're a customer of the company or not. I'm going to go and do some digging around afterwards to find out who that was.
Good luck on this one, but indeed I think it's more about how not to talk about culture and your own culture, and I think there was some mishandling of that rather than the anti-criteria, because I personally think anti-criteria are great and a great way to be like, don't apply to here if it's a great way to filter out candidates. Question from Chrysanthi there. What happens with companies that are hiring employees remotely? How would you go about compensation transparency in such cases where country economies and harbor laws differ? How could they share salary ranges? Well, it's a case for us, right? And like if you were to go, and maybe you can pull up some of, so we just opened a CSM role yesterday. Maybe you can push the job ad on there. And we're hiring remotely. You can work from everywhere, 2.5 hours at most by plane from Paris. for carbon footprint reasons. We just advertising 1, 2, or 3 locations, but we're saying that our policy is that we will localize pay using the highest pay city or the country's capital in each country that we might hire you in. So we're not displaying salary range for Belgium, but we're telling you that if you apply from Belgium and we hire you in Belgium, this is how we go to ensure that you're being paid fairly. And that brings me to one point there, Chrysanthi. There's a study by Josh Bersin that shows that beyond a certain amount of money, like the minimal wage amount and so on, of course, there's some people who care about ensuring you have a decent wage. For most like white collar workers, what's most important, not necessarily the amount of what you're getting or the amount of the salary increase you're getting, is ensuring you're being treated fairly. It has 13 times more impact than the pure amount and increase. What means is people want to know they're being treated fairly. That's like procedural fairness. They want to ensure as candidate that they of course they care about the salary range, but more than the salary range, they care about explaining the context and the reason around the salary range. And showing them that you treat them fairly will go a long way in being efficient when hiring and when retaining people. So to our point, and I'm finishing on that, I'll show up whenever we hire someone, as part of the job ad, you're going to see we disclose our salary ranges. When we make an offer, we say, hey, this is what we're offering you, because those are our salary ranges. Those salary ranges are based on this market data. Our policy is to target the market data median. In your case, you are located in this area, so we use this market data. We saw that your experience puts you in the higher part of the range. We explain our offers to people, and you know what? We have some people that accepted our offers, and which was below their expectation, just because they were like, you know what? I'm keen to work for a company that seems to be treated people fairly when it comes to compensation. So people want to understand first and foremost. And if you explain it in your job ad, it'll be fine. I swear it'll be fine.
Yeah, I just did chip in on that with an example. The company we worked with a month or so ago, fully remote, they just, what separates the right companies and the wrong companies here is that they have a policy, they have an approach. Like Virgil's mentioned, the figures have an approach and a policy that works for them, and they've established that it's fair up front. So when they do go out to hire remotely, it doesn't matter, and that they're set up. And this company was firm to the point where they said we pay based on London salaries, which globally there's a couple of locations that may be a little bit more expensive to live in, but London's a pretty good marker to work by. If they hire someone in London, they know they're paying fair money. They hire people in Brazil, they still pay them based on London salaries, which some might seem as like, whoa, that's a lot of money. They're living like a king or a queen over there. But that's the company policy. It works for them, and they think that is fair. They want their employees internally to be paid fairly compared to each other, regardless of where they are. So there's no right answer to that question for me in some respects, other than the companies to come up with a compensation philosophy that works for them in the bounds of their business, and have that written in stone and crystal clear. And that's another conversation around compensation transparent philosophy. But yeah, that's the first step, is get that in place, I would suggest.
I'm just having a flashback to my marketing studies back then, talking about the Big Mac index, the price index, which kind of reflects the purchasing power parity when you compare different currencies and countries. And I think this is a really, really good question here.
Yeah, no, I think it's the to add to Adam's point, waiting for more questions. Once again, folks, if you have any questions, throw them at us. Is like, I don't think there's an ultimate truth into what's fair when it comes to remote pay. But any company needs to go and find what's true to them, what's fair to them, and once again needs to be objective and structured when they go about pay, right? Showing they have a fair systemic way of dealing with compensation will go a long way in reassuring people. Once again, and I think has been part of transparent companies now for 5 years, fully transparent, like externally and so on. And once again, that's not for everyone. But being upfront about the fact that we are, once again, allow us to attract some people who are like, I love that, and have some people being like, you know what, I'm not at ease with that ultimate radical transparency, which is perfect, once again. But I'd say this, it generates the kind of trust that you struggle to find in less transparent environment. Because once again, for us, and overall transparency is all about generating trust from candidates and trust from employees, which will go a long way into being more attractive employer and being better at keeping your employees engaged. anything we might have missed into how great example of companies being transparent throughout the hiring process or employer branding? Anything comes to mind, Marcus or Adam, before we move to concrete steps that we want to recommend to companies and head of HR and head of TA out there who wants to start on this journey?
I have one point I try and encourage people to do when they're thinking about things like EVP and employer brand and what that looks like. I think that a lot of the advice you tend to get from people in that world is to look at your pillars, define your pillars, and if you go online, there's lots of different views about what pillars are and what they should be. But anyway, the advice typically is pick out the strongest ones and focus on them, lean on them, share them. People should be looking at their entire EVP, not just the great pillars, but their weak ones as well, the ones that we're not great at, and they should be sharing those, talking about them. That vulnerability and that area of weakness is actually super appealing to some people. And to actually hide things like diversity because we're not doing great there, people see through that. But if you can bring that to the foreground and tell candidates, let's talk about diversity. We're not doing great. We've got some commitments. We're failing. We're this, that, or the other, whatever that message might be. People love that. They appreciate that. And actually, the people who really care about diversity will spot an opportunity there to apply and say, I can come in and make a difference here. I can bring some personality, some passion into this, and I can hopefully make a difference because this company at least seems to care about doing something different. So looking at your entire EVP, if you're trying to build out your brand, is the best way to go. And don't hide any of it. Share it all with the world. And that's the important part.
Being honest, authentic, and vulnerable at times can go a long way, right? That's what you are saying. Marcus?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you really want to do employer branding in a structured and an honest way, then this is exactly the way you have to go for. I mean, now within these 2.5 years, we had around 35, 36 projects that we did with small, medium, and big-sized companies. Like, there's something that I keep on thinking about in the last month. I don't know how it is for you, but at least here in Germany, like, these fuck up nights are very, very popular. You know, when it comes to, I founded a company and failed and I did this and that wrong, and that's my learning. Actually, I never hear this from company responsibles, you know, from management boards and stuff like that. And this is exactly what we just talked about. I think it makes it so natural, gives you such a good feeling if companies are a bit more low profile and say, hey, we are not perfect in everything. There's always room for improvement, because if there's no room for improvement, basically, then they also don't need people who maybe might be skilled in this part. So yeah, I totally underline what you just said, Adam.
So, folks, time for our conclusion. What are your most, or you're allowed your 2 or 3 most actionable advice for people out there that want to start their journey as a company towards more transparency? Adam, you want to go first?
Actually, yeah, I should probably have shared a link on there. We've got a nice resource that sort of talks you through your journey you could take, but very, very high level. Establish a trigger point for why the business case around transparency, why you need it. Run a diagnostic to understand where you're transparent and where you're not. Define transparency as a leadership team. Give it meaning so that you can then roadmap and prioritize quick wins and longer term areas of transparency that are important. Communicate it all the way through at every step of the way, and also keep revisiting it. Keep understanding, what are we doing? How are we doing it? Do we still need to be doing it? The companies that fail with this take their foot off the gas because they maybe see it as a PR exercise short term, and then they don't care about it and they withdraw. So that's very, very quick, but maybe I'll share a quick link to this on chat, actually, because I'll find it and share it while Marcus is talking.
Yeah, go for it, Marcus.
Yeah, I think like the key thing is practice what you preach, because the worst will be to stand there and say, wow, we're super transparent, and then people find out you're actually not. So, and like being transparent, I think it also needs some steps to do so, basically. So just to name a few, it's, of course, the management can be completely convinced about transparency, but I think it's also important to implement this into your leadership. So all the team leads and whatsoever also need to go this way. So convince your leadership of the necessity of transparency, basically. And I think it's about communication channels. You need to have somehow some feedback or communication possibilities, which is super important. And then it's also about encouraging your employees to really ask questions and to give also bottom-up feedback. I mean, how stupid would it be to say we're super transparent, but there's no way you can reach us as a management here? And then maybe last but not least is also, that brings me a bit back to when back then we implemented this at Xing, make information accessible and not just, you have to click on the 27th subpage, but, really transparency and availability of information. And yeah, once again, practice what you preach.
Thanks, both of you. I wanted to add something. I felt like I wanted to add the one thing about making a strong business case, but you both mentioned it, right? I think talking to a lot of HR leaders out there, I think the number one thing they're asking for is like, how do I make leadership aware that it's a necessity? Once again, more transparency is inevitable, not only in pay, this is what you say, but overall. And companies that start now their journey towards more transparency are going to be the winners of tomorrow, right? Are going to be the ones that are going to be ready for the market shift. Before it's a legal shift, it's a market shift, remember? They're going to be the ones who are going to be more attractive to candidates, have a stronger engagement rate, and so on. So it's better to start early than late. And Adam and Marcus gave you great tips. So on those notes, I want to thank, first of all, Adam and Marcus. Thanks to both of you for attending and coming in onto this webinar. And everyone else, and those watching in replays, more and more these days, thanks a lot for your time. And I hope you learned something very actionable today. Best of luck with the rest of your day, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.